Hey friends, thanks for taking time to listen in on a conversation Dick, Joe Sayward, and I had about the 2026 Canadian Grand Prix. George Russell's engine blew. Kimi Antonelli, on the final 2 laps, set the 2 fastest times of the race. Meanwhile, Charles Leclerc called it his worst weekend in Formula One. Lewis Hamilton finished on the podium and looked like he was having the time of his life. As you'll hear, those 2 stories, one about what it costs to lose momentum and one about what happens when you finally stop trying to prove something, took over a conversation we thought would be about tires. And then, somewhere between Red Bull and the back of the pack, the 3 of us ended up somewhere we did not plan to go. That conversation is getting its own episode. But before we get to our conversation, I need to ask, can you help us out? If this show adds value to your F1 experience, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app. Share this episode with other F1 fans. That's how people find us, and it's how we keep growing this community. Hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, gentlemen, it is the days after the Canadian Grand Prix. A lot to dive into, and I'm looking forward to hearing you guys' thoughts. So if anything, I'd like to start with what was your race highlight? Dick, you want to go first?
I thought for me, my race highlight was really the fact that the new engine regulations that they tweaked in Miami seemed to work pretty well in Montreal. I was not sure what to think because my understanding is that the track was not as good for energy harvesting as, say, Miami would be. But it, based on the onboard video that I was seeing, the cars were not drastically hampered by running out of energy at the end of straightaways and those sorts of things. And so as a result, I felt like the racing was a lot closer to being pure as opposed to being manufactured due to the fact that, when you had power and when you did not have power would kind of dictate when somebody was going to pass you. So that was my take on it. I found it to be a very entertaining race. In fact, I thought the whole weekend was pretty entertaining.
What about you, Joe?
I think there's only one highlight, which was the battle between George and Kimi in both races, to be honest. And it was just so nice to see 2 guys really going for it. I mean, I thought George did some pretty dodgy things to Kimi, to be honest. But, that's just, for me, that's a sign that George is struggling to hold him back, where you're resorting to slightly, I wouldn't say they were entirely dubious, but some of them were, Kimi doesn't get upset about a lot of stuff, and he got upset about a couple of things. And, for me, it's just a good sign anyway, in a way, because we're going to have some great races this year. I think, the fact that George blew up and Kimi's now got an enormous lead in the championship is even more pressure on George. But he showed that he can fight back from it. In the end, it didn't work out. But I think in the overall scheme of things, I think Kimi would have beaten him if George hadn't blown up. But that's just, you can't prove it one way or the other. I just got the impression that Kimi had it more under control than George did. So he shouldn't have made that mistake, though, which let George by in the race itself. That was Kimi pushing too hard. But if you watched him later in the race when he wasn't under pressure, he set the 2 fastest laps of the race on the penultimate and ultimate lap. So he's got the pace. And, clearly the Mercedes is way ahead of everybody else. And the upgrades clearly worked. It might have been a little bit disguised by, there's any number of things that might have disguised it, the layout of the track, the temperature, for example. Normally the murk is better in the cold than it was in the race. It was a lot better than it was in the qualifying. In the sprint rather, which was much warmer. Well, a little bit warmer. But basically, I just think they've got it all under control, and when they need the pace, they can pull out a bit more. So I'm not saying that they're sandbagging, but they may not be using all of it.
Okay, gentlemen, that's actually a great segue to discussing the front of the pack. How do you think those who are at the front are pushing themselves and each other? So, Dick, why don't you go first?
Well, I think, obviously Mercedes is the class of the field right now. I I think that they may be I I think they may be holding back just a little bit, actually, to save the equipment. They don't have to go at 100% because they're so far ahead of everyone else. And I think it's a combination of things. Yes, they did bring an aero package to Montreal, and it obviously worked very well, because they took another step relative to some of the other teams who, in Miami, for example, it kind of looked like McLaren may have caught them up. But then this new package comes out for Mercedes, and sure enough, they're, again, they gap McLaren. Um, and so I think it's a combination of the aero, but I think they also understand their engine best, which makes total sense. And so I think the way they harvest energy and deploy it is just a little bit better in all different spots around the track, and that all adds up to lap time. And so, I really believe that from an engineering standpoint, that they are the guys right now, guys and girls, to beat. As far as George and Kimi is concerned, I can't wait to hear what Joe has to say about this, since he knows those drivers. But it's obvious that Kimi is in that mode of success breeding success, and so he's going from strength to strength. George, on the other hand, I think is maybe certainly feeling the pressure and maybe a little bit rattled. I don't know, but especially after what happened with the engine failure that he had in Montreal, I'm sure he's feeling like a cloud's hanging over his head right now. This is two times now where the cartoon anvil has fallen out of the sky and hit his car. He had the pace car and the timing of a pit stop that basically destroyed his race in Japan, and now you have an engine failure. So I'm sure he's kind of feeling it, but he also should be experienced enough to know that things have a way of balancing themselves out over the course of a season. So that's kind of my take.
Well, you'll never convince me that they weren't going flat out in Canada.
Oh, okay.
Those two guys were absolutely on it. And to the level where they were both making mistakes left, right, and center. I thought that George's Kimi's mistake in the sprint race was to try to go around the outside, which was over enthusiastic. That George squeezed him off the track, which for me was a sign of George not being entirely fair. But it's kind of 50-50 in that one. And in the main race, I think one has to ask the question, there's always luck involved. But sometimes there are drivers who have more bad luck, engine failures, mechanical failures than others. And I think you have to also take into account, I'm not saying this is the case with George necessarily, but some drivers are harder on machinery than others. So, and that's really important, because when you have somebody who respects the machinery, it's going to last longer.
Yeah, I mean, I said this in real time to Dick. We were texting, is that I wondered how much the vehicle was being placed under stress. And was that specific to George, or was that something that maybe the Mercedes car had not experienced yet from previous tracks? But then when you say what you're saying right now about how they were racing and why the failure occurred on George's part, that gives me enough to think that there could be either or both happening. And I don't know that we can draw any conclusions as outsiders, let alone just from one race. I think we'll have to wait and see where things are. I do think that question raises in my mind because of all the conversation regarding these regulations and the power unit and what we're seeing. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind as we look at future races to see, is this a perpetual reliability issue? Let's move on to Ferrari then. Are they on the right development path? or was Canada a circuit that was just particularly suited to the car? I say that more because of what we saw happen to Lewis than what happened to Charles. But I wonder what y'all's thoughts are on that. Dick, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, Ferrari have certainly improved, but they haven't improved enough, and um, I think they have a car that's probably, I don't know, probably the second best car right now, third maybe. Um, and then Montreal, I think, suited that car pretty well because it seems to be pretty quick in a straight line. Um, and certainly the Ferrari drivers used it to great effect. I will say that I'm enjoying watching Lewis have fun again. And I certainly enjoyed, actually, I thought he was hugely entertaining all weekend long, quite frankly. And his pursuit of Max on Sunday and eventually, stalking him, well, I should say catching him, stalking him, and then making the pass. I was cheering. I was really pleased for him. So, yeah, overall, I think it was a good weekend. We'll see about Monaco, what happens there, but because that track is so unique and specific and all that kind of stuff, I don't know if we'll be able to draw any conclusions. But like I said, I think Ferrari's probably about the second best car on the field right now.
Joe, I wonder if you agree with Dick on this. And then also, could you elaborate a little bit about the pairing? What can we draw from what we saw about their response to their cars during their weekend? I'm talking about Charles and Lewis.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Ferrari's made that much progress. I think they did make progress in Miami. I'm not sure if there was any major progress. I think what's happened is that Lewis has got more of a car he likes. And at the minute you have confidence in the car, and Canada's a place where confidence is really important. And so I think that we can't really say one way or the other. What's significant there, I think, is that Charles is not a happy bunny at the moment. He's not happy with the team. There was that radio message halfway through where he said, "Don't talk to me. I don't want to talk to you," which was very, very brusque and very, very sort of unhappy. And that comes after the Miami, his last lap in Miami, which was chaos. And there's clearly, we're into the driver market now. And I think he's trying to figure out what to do and also who wants him, And so it's not perfect down there. And he's been there, he will soon, later this season, become the Ferrari driver with more starts in a Grand Prix than any other in the history of the World Championship. He overtakes Michael Schumacher. And he hasn't won it championship-wise, and he must be asking himself, am I in the right place? And I can tell him the answer. That's very simple. No, Ferrari is not. It hasn't won in a generation. Arvid Lindblad was just about born when they last won a championship. That's how bad it is, and they're not going to fix it if they keep on doing the same things they keep on doing, which is not the right thing. The right thing is just to basically start again and clear out the mentality. That's the problem they have there. There's a mentality problem, and you can't fix that just by bringing in one person. Jean Todt did it the last time. He came in and he brought a whole crew of people, and they sort of formed the company around Todd and around Schumacher and around Ross Brawn, and then they controlled things. They didn't go and sort of react to every news report there was. And in lots of respects, we've just had the launch of the new Ferrari electric car, and Ferrari's share price went through the floor yesterday because it's just not. And as Luca de Montezemolo says, he actually said, I won't tell you what I really think about it because it would be hurt Ferrari. But
yeah,
that is, Ferrari ain't what it used to be. And it's still got this myth and the magic and bloody blah, all that stuff. But it's not, they're still selling more cars than anybody else. in terms of that, corner of the market, they are still the coolest car to have if that's what you want. But there's a lot wrong there.
What I hear is you're drawing a distinction between Ferrari, the overall brand, and Ferrari, the Formula One team. They interplay, but we shouldn't mistake them as being the same thing.
What I'm actually saying is that there's a danger of the road cars, which have been very successful, going the same way as, just doing things that don't make a lot of sense. I mean, yes, electric cars do make sense for Ferrari in the long term, perhaps, depending on the way the market develops. And we don't know. This is the key point about all this talk about V8s in Formula One, all the changes in rallying. We have no idea where and when the market is going to decide. At the moment, we've got car companies going into electric, coming out of electric. We've got hybrid. We've got people going back to internal combustion engines entirely, saying that they'll save the world with fuel that costs an absolute fortune. All these things happening at the same time. Nobody's clear, and we won't be clear for another 5 to 10 years probably. So it's totally insane to change the rules, particularly if you're going back to a V8, normally aspirated V8 without any hybrid, which is what Mohammed bin Sulayem wants to do. That's madness. That's utter madness, because Formula One is not an entertainment formula in the way that other championships are. And if you go to something and think that it'll be entertainment and all the car manufacturers will be there because it's Formula One, they might be. But they might not be as well, because you need a technological edge. Formula One is about technology. It's not just about driving around with Cosworths, And some of these guys are living in the past massively. Bin Sulayem being the prime example of that. It's just, if he's going to destroy Formula One, that's a good way of doing it. Taking out the technology is a disaster.
I think if anything, Dick, I wonder what your thoughts are as a racer watching both Charles's reaction and even going further on what you said about Lewis, knowing what Joe has just said about the driver market, the internal stuff. Like, how as a driver do you avoid, or how does that impact the external? And then all of a sudden you're on track and a car under you isn't comfortable. Can you give us a little bit of the racer mind?
Well, I think, and I think Joe would agree with this. I think it depends on how hardened that driver is and how under control his emotions are. If you get some guy that's just totally hard, he's not going to care about all the politics once he snaps the visor down. He's just going to go for it. Mostly, right? I mean, they are human and they will have cracks, but they, generally speaking, can block that out. But you have somebody that's maybe a little bit, maybe, I'm not going to say emotionally fragile, but maybe just not as hardened mentally. All that distraction is going to get to them. And I think there's a danger for Charles, because he's now dealing with a Lewis Hamilton who's happy and loose as a goose and knows he has nothing to prove, but he's enjoying his driving again, clearly enjoying himself. And that could be a real problem for Charles if your head's not in a good place, because Charles was used to beating up on Lewis last year, right? He just destroyed him. Not the case this year. And so Charles needs to be careful and not let all that stuff distract from what he's trying to do. That's my take.
Yeah. Well, and I'm even thinking about, like, in the business world or in just outside of racing, we see intergenerational coworkers. I think of Lewis as an older millennial, and I think Charles would fit in the younger, or I guess the next generation. I can't remember, what is it?
Sure.
Gen Z?
Gen X, probably.
Gen X?
Gen Z,
I never
probably.
remember what the letters are.
I can't remember.
You see how they respond to the same crisis in a business, or same challenges are going to manifest differently because of the experience they've had and or where they are in the stage of their career. Someone who has seen the ups and downs of both the industry, the business, and or their own career, is going to ride out challenges very differently than someone who has a lot to prove, and or they need to show their value to the industry so that way their price, their value to other competitors, if they want to move that way, will still maintain that value. So I can see how they're both in the same chaos isn't the right word, just the allure that the business has. I'm talking about Ferrari and all the things that Joe just said, but they're responding very differently, and it's manifesting onto the track, and we'll just have to wait and see. It looks like, Joe, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think that something that people, fans need to kind of understand, and that is sometimes when these guys come sailing in with perfect careers, they win in Formula 3, they win in Formula 2, they come into Formula 1, they get to the top. They're not as well prepared as the guys who struggled, because mentally they haven't had to struggle. There used to be a case years and years ago when a lot of drivers had to go to Japan when they couldn't make it because they didn't have the money. So they went to race in Japan. And the guys who raced in Japan were generally stronger mentally than the ones, so the Eddie Irvines of the world who came into Formula One via the Japanese route was much stronger than some of the ones who just came sailing up because it was too easy for them. So you have people like Albon, you have people like Ocon. They really struggle to get there, and you can't break them. They are, you can trample on them, you can break their fingers, and they'll still come back and they'll still be strong.
Yeah.
And others who've had it more easily aren't like that. So it's an interesting reflection.
Yeah, I think it's a really good one. And if anything, it's a great segue to the McLaren. You've got, talk about needing resilience. Both of the drivers this weekend had a pretty challenging strategy decision that I would say some of it comes down to them too, because they're not passive in the role of tire strategy. They were a part of it. But do you think that that is what it all came down to? That it was the tire strategy, it was just a bad call ultimately?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a bad call. It happens. It's not something that's systematic failure on behalf of McLaren. Every team has screw ups, and it's just a screw up. And I think it's because the conditions were clearly really difficult. The rain was coming and going, and it wasn't quite sure. And again, if you look at when they set off from the grid, the wide range of different tire choices, people didn't know what to do. And by the time they got round and all that mess at the start, no quite sure what happened there. But they did 2 extra parade laps because the lights didn't function properly or something. And basically, by the time they were finishing the second of those, Piastri was on the radio saying, "We got to change. And the team was being cautious and stick with it. But basically, in the time it took to go around that track twice at slow speed, Oscar had realized that he was in the wrong place. So, but there's, I think once it's done, there's nothing you can do.
Dick, agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, in my mind, I think McLaren knew that the only way they were going to win was if they rolled the dice, maybe. I'm speculating here, but it feels like they were rolling the dice and saying, hey, based on what we're seeing on the forecast and all that, this is our opportunity to pull one out of the bag, so to speak. And it backfired. And the other thing that I wonder about is why didn't they cover their bets and start one car on, say, softs and one on intermediates? That was my other question. But
that works 2 ways, Dick, because that means you always get something wrong. If you're going for maximum points, sometimes
true.
To put all your eggs in one basket, because that way you'll get maximum points. If you compromise, you only get half maximum points, aren't you? So yeah. There is logic in just gambling on one way.
True.
But at the end of the day, they ended up with nothing. So
that's right. Right. They got the third option.
Yeah, the third option that you don't want to really think as an option out there is what they landed on.
It's not really an option, but it is. Yep.
I guess I'm kind of in between the two of you. One part of me wants to be gracious and say, oh, a lot of people made errors. The other side of me says, I think you made a calculated high risk decision and it just didn't land that way. But overall, I think over the end of last year, there were certain strategic calls, especially which race was it, where they didn't go into the pits and everybody else did, and you just watched in horror. I put those
Yes.
pieces and I go, for a team that's won the championship, not once, but twice, you don't expect to see these kinds of big messes unless it goes back to high risk, high reward. You're willing to gamble it. And it just didn't land in the direction. It went to option 3 that they don't want to see happen.
I think there's something here. Some teams, and we used to have a good example of this was Jordan. A lot of teams have a lot of people thinking about strategy. They have entire rooms full of people thinking about strategy. And the Jordan team in the old days, they won Spa one year because Gary Anderson, basically everyone was going, is it raining? Is it not raining? And Gary Anderson put his hand outside from the umbrella and went, that's raining. Too many people spend their time staring at screens and not doing the sensible thing. And I think sometimes some of these teams that have massive crews all working on different strategies get so confused that they lose track of who's making the decision at the right time. Sometimes it's best just to have one bloke saying, we're doing this, and not somebody saying, if you do this,
Yeah. I do think that there's some validity to that, because if anything, as you said, what was happening from the reconnaissance laps to the time where they have to make the final call, that's going to require some quick thinking, analysis. And if you're now got a committee of people and you're having to make that call, it might have just been, let's just do it. And they knew that this was a high risk, and that's what they landed on. So, okay, I can give you that. Let's move on to Red Bull. What, if anything, can we draw about where Red Bull is, where Max is, where Isaac is from this race? Dick, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think, obviously, Red Bull has certainly taken a step forward based on the package that they brought to Miami. And they scored their first podium as a Ford powered car, Ford in air quotes. And so, I think they're getting to be in a bit more competitive position, but Montreal also, I think everybody would say that it's a little bit of an anomaly because of the problems that McLaren ran into and, those sorts of things. And so, and George blowing up, there's 3 cars that probably should have finished in front of Max. So, you kind of got to balance that out, but, racing does have luck, like Joe was talking about. And so, I think that they still have a lot of work to do. But I think as the silly season progresses and what's Max going to do and all that kind of stuff, those are distractions that are going to have to be managed, I think, as the season goes on, because there's already a lot of noise about Max. You kind of got to wonder how much more noise are we going to hear. So,
Joe, what about you?
I don't think they did anything special in Montreal. I didn't think it was that great. I think Dick's right about they're on the podium because other people should have been and weren't. I think what was very clear in the early part of the weekend, Max is not a happy boy at all. He didn't like the car. And that's also why Isaac was closer to him, because Isaac was much closer than one would expect to see him. Obviously, he's getting better because he's learning, all the rest of it. But, at the end of the day, he was still closer than you'd expect to see him. And so I think it's because Max just wasn't confident and happy with the car. So I don't think we got a true picture of where they were from the results. And I just think I don't think they've made that much progress. So I don't think we should get too excited about it all. Obviously, Monaco when we see what happens there, and Max is going to be Max. So, they might shine a lot more as well. So we'll just have to see. But all these tracks have different elements to them. For example, the temperature in Montreal was very low, and traditionally Mercedes go better in low temperatures than they do in high temperatures, or for the last couple of years anyway. So, and there's no particular logic to that. It's just the way, I'm sure there is logic to it, but if they could figure it out, they would have changed the car so it works in all different temperatures, wouldn't they? At the end of the day, there are all these different elements. So one has to look at levels of competitiveness over a period of time, taking into account all the local elements that make each race different.
Yeah. I want to see them get to Barcelona. I do agree that Monaco will not be a great standard analysis that we can figure out from there. So, okay, let's move on to the middle of the pack. Do we think that there were breakthroughs there? And what are we seeing from some of these teams? I'm thinking of Alpine, Racing Bulls, Haas, and Williams when I'm thinking middle of the pack. So let's start with Alpine. Do you think they reached where the car is essentially equal between the two drivers and where they want to be? Joe, you want to go first?
Absolutely not, because there's something wrong. Pierre isn't happy. He thinks there's something wrong with the car. They can't pinpoint it at the moment, but Franco is far too competitive in relation to Pierre. And to be honest, I don't think that Franco is in the same league as Pierre as a driver. That's my opinion. But maybe he can develop into that at one time. But in terms of natural talent, I don't think he's got it. And in the same level, I'm not saying, of course, he's got it to be in Formula One, but Pierre is a very, very good driver, and he's just not been delivering. So
let me ask you this, because I think that's a good distinction to kind of speak into. When you say he's not on the same level, you're not saying he's like leaps and bounds dramatically away from him, are you? But it's still not on parity, is what I'm hearing you say.
It's also about the level of experience. It's about the level of confidence. Pierre has been driving fantastically for the last year or so. And he really has been picking up Alpine and leading them forward to the extent to which, they've just announced in the last few minutes, actually, that Gucci is their new title sponsor. So they're convincing people. Yeah, that was why I was getting a kerfuffle earlier on, and you heard music in the background, is because that was a message going through. That they've convinced a very big player in the luxury world to be their title sponsor. So there's clearly, there's potential there, and they are coming forward. But right now, something is wrong with Pierre, or Pierre's relationship with Pierre's. Again, he's a tough one. And he's not going to be, he wants to find a solution, but they don't know what the solution is yet. When they find that solution, Pierre will be ahead again, I think. And then we'll also see more points being scored, because, Pierre will be, he'll be up there taking it to the Red Bulls, as he has been, in the early races this year. It's just that right now it's not happening.
I just think that it's important, because especially we've talked about this, I think on the record, but definitely offline. And I know you've written about this in the JSBM newsletter, is this fandom when it comes to Franco, and any kind of critique is seen so ardently like protective. And I think it's important to recognize we have to be intellectually honest versus emotionally so passionate that we can't see that feedback, even if it's critical, isn't meant as an attack. It's meant to acknowledge reality. And it's also important because I think overall, especially new fans that are coming in, when you don't realize that when you say someone's not on par, it doesn't mean you're just saying they're terrible. It's just they're not to the level, and it's not saying they can't reach it. You're not saying that Franco doesn't have talent and isn't capable. You're just saying he's not there yet. And that's the key word, the word yet. And the team, hopefully, I would hope that any team that hires somebody would want to see that potential, because it goes back to bringing in sponsors and keeping the team afloat and developing your car, all the reason why they're in this business. So that's why I just wanted to lean into that a little bit. But Dick, before we move on to the other teams, I just wanted to get your inputs. Did you have any thoughts to what Joe said or what I just said?
Yeah, I'm pretty much aligned with Joe's analysis on it. I will throw a couple of caveats in there. Many times a driver is considered superior to his teammate, and he's only, 1 or 2 tenths quicker, right? I mean, it's a very, very small margin, but that gap is a deal where the faster driver is literally picking up a few hundredths of a second in every corner. And at the end of the lap, you've got a 15 turn track and you're 1.5 tenths ahead of your teammate, and that's how fine the line is. And 100th of a second, that's turning the steering wheel just a little bit too much and inducing a little bit too much front tire drag in a corner. I mean, it's literally down to that. And so, speaking as a driver myself, I'm just kind of like, well, for me, I'm 1/10 of a second off on some tracks in each corner. Well, I'm down a second a lap before I even start, and so where do I find that 1/10 of a second? That's just me doing the hard work and finding it, if I can find it. And so that's the difference, I think. It's just super, super fine margins, but they all add up. And it's the same with the development of the cars. If you find 0.3 of a second of performance in a lap, but somebody else has found half a second, okay, you've made a gain, but you're still behind, And so, there's a lot of teams that are in that mode. And we saw that with Mercedes and this package that they brought, right? And we've kind of talked about that. But the other thing that I will say is that while I don't disagree with Joe about Pierre relative to Franco, also Franco has delivered the goods the last 2 races. He's got a 7th in Miami and a 6th at Montreal, I think. So, I mean, those are good results, but it would be interesting to see what will happen when Pierre gets happy again.
And those are tracks where Franco's now returning to, which he had not been to. So I think I like how you pointed out that this fractional element is the differential, and we can easily overlook that. It's a much higher gravity and become defensive, where instead, if you realize these are fractional margins that are differentiating them. So, okay, we could keep talking, but I know that we've got to be mindful of our clock. So let's move on to Racing Bulls, Haas and Williams. Racing Bulls, any thoughts about what's going on there? Joe, you want to go first? No? Dick, you got any thoughts? No.
I don't think there's anything to say, to be honest. No. Yep. I think the point is there that they did very well to start, but the smaller teams always they can't keep up the development race as fast as the bigger teams. So as the season goes on, they tend to have fewer updates, and therefore they tend to fall behind a little bit. And I think we're beginning to see that with them. We're beginning to see that with Haas for sure. And they do the best they can. And, when they do bring an upgrade, it works, but they just can't bring as many. And Williams, that's been a problem right from the start. That car needs fixing because production problems meant it had to be frozen earlier than it should have been in order to get the car out on time. So, they need to improve their production capacity, their industrial, whatever you want to call it, not just their performance. They need to do their industrial performance, and they're doing it. They've just announced hiring McLaren's, basically their head of production, is going to Williams. And there were a whole bunch of hires last week who are all top people. And so Williams is, they're sort of on the move. The car will get better because they're losing weight. Alex Albon's an unlucky guy. To hit a groundhog and then be taking out Oscar Piastri on the same weekend is a bit of a tough one for him. And Carlos is getting a bit frustrated because he was promised the world and the world hasn't quite happened. So you can see in that little group there that there are frustrations, but it's There are logical explanations for it all.
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. And I don't know if Carlos plays in the silly season or not. Um, Maybe. I don't know. I mean, Joe, you'd have a better feel for it, but I've kind of wondered about that. And of course, I guess the domino there that you have to look at is what does Max do? And then what's the knock-on effect for all of that in the driver market?
I think Ferrari might benefit from Carlos if one of the two moves on, because
Mm-hmm.
Carlos knows the team. He did a great job when he was at Ferrari. He
Yeah,
got
he did.
booted. He got booted out because it was Lewis Hamilton coming, and it might be wise um, for them if they do lose a driver. I mean, obviously Ollie Behrman's on their list as the next guy coming. But
Yep.
if say they lose two at the same time, which could happen, Lewis says he's not retiring, but and he's having a ball and all the rest of this stuff. But sometimes they don't make the decisions. The decisions are made for them.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles might make a decision, I'm walking. And all these things. The trouble with the silly season is, and it's the same thing with Haas, for example. So Ollie Behrman's done a great job. Esteban has had not hasn't looked as good, which isn't really fair because Esteban's pretty decent. Ollie's very good. But if Ollie goes to Ferrari, they don't want to lose Esteban. So you have a knock-on effect of one decision. So Ollie goes, and then they need Esteban to keep some stability, even if they know that Esteban wasn't as good as Ollie on paper. So the silly season plays out in weird and wacky ways, and sometimes the decisions you can't predict them because sometimes they're based on what happens if, and the if happens.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's good. I think then, if anything, I'd like to just see if there's any thoughts regarding the back of the pack. Maybe it'd be kinder not to say very much about Aston Martin, Audi, and Cadillac, but I will leave that open for you both.
Yeah, there's nothing really interesting there. I think the interesting thing is the fact that Aston Martin's not bringing upgrades at all. And for me, that means they're not bringing upgrades because they're spending all the money on building a new car. That can only be the explanation because they got plenty of money, but they have the budget cap restraining them. And if they're not improving the car, it means that they've decided the car's so bad that they want to build another one before the end of the year. So that would be my feeling. Cadillac, it's pretty much what everyone expected apart from the people at Cadillac. And Audi, it's a new project. They've shown really well at certain places. They're just a bit sort of nowhere at the moment. So I don't think there's very much to say about the back end. There's some rumors about Bottas. Cadillac wanting to get rid of Bottas, but why on earth would you do that? You've got to find somebody who wants to drive that thing, first of all. And second of all, Bottas has got a ton of experience that can help them. And I saw some rumors, people suggesting that Herta might get in there. Well, Herta needs to actually do something in Formula 2 first. He hasn't got a super license. And I think he finished in the top 10 in the reverse grid race, and half the drivers fell off, or got penalties or something. But, he's not doing the job yet, and he hasn't got a super license yet. So let's just be reasonable about this sort of stuff. He's not going to do any good, and you don't want to promote somebody who's going to not do it well. He's got to learn how to do it. Yep. I always thought it was a less than sensible move for him, but I get it. People want to be Formula One drivers, but if you're a winning driver in IndyCar, to give it up and go back and then not make it in Formula 2 is slightly worrying, I would think, for them. Incidentally, from an American perspective, and you probably won't have read of this much, but in Formula Regional Europe at the weekend, Sebastian Weldon won 2 races, his first 2 races, which is Dan Weldon's boy, and he is one of the Andretti school, and he's coming up through the European system. And a lot of people think he's the guy who's going to come in the fullness of time more likely into Formula One than Herta is, because Herta's got so much to learn. He's got talent, there's no question about it. But, he's much older. He's being beaten by guys far younger. And, he's got a lot to get his head around. And he might not. He might not be able to do that. He might just say, oh, this is crazy. I'm going back to America where I know how to do it and I can win. And I get that. So we'll see how it all develops. But, you can't just, and I've been saying this for years, which is why I always thought it was bizarre. You can't just parachute somebody in from IndyCar and expect them to win in Formula One. It just doesn't happen. It used to in the 60s. It didn't really work in any time after that. Michael Andretti nearly got close to being, but not. In the end, he didn't. And, it's too difficult now. And that's something that American fans, particularly the new lot, need to understand, that you can't just because Joseph Newgarden is good in Indy cars, doesn't mean that he'd be any good in Formula One.
Mm-hmm.
And, it kind of works the other way around a little bit. Sometimes when Formula One people go into IndyCar championships, they do better. But that's, I think, is a sign of where Formula One, the level is compared to IndyCar. So there's always a lot of hype, about how great it is. And, when Indy 500's been on, everyone's banging on about how wonderful the Indy 500 is and all the rest of it. But when you boil it down, you have people who are winning the 500 like Sato and Ericsson who didn't make it in Formula One. So, or Palau even. I mean, Palau is a good driver, but he couldn't get to Formula One. So anyway, there you go. It is something that you need to bear in mind as, again, the question of realism about what it takes to be in Formula One. It is not easy.
Dick, I feel like I can't end the conversation without allowing you to give your thoughts on everything Joe just said, because I know as an American racer and as a fan of both disciplines, you have thoughts.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with what Joe's saying. I will say that that I enjoy both disciplines because they are very different. And the fact that, like an IndyCar, you're running a spec chassis that is old and has been massaged multiple times. They've built like 200 chassis, I think, something like that, over the course of the existence of this current, formula. Some of the racing has been absolutely spectacular. When you understand that, in the last practice before this year's 500, the telemetry caught Joseph Newgarden doing 240 miles an hour flat into turn 3, and an average speed on that lap, he did 228 in traffic as an average speed. That's mightily impressive, if only from the sheer courage it takes to do that, knowing that there's a big wall sitting there on the outside of the turn waiting to smack you. And a lot of Formula One drivers flat out say, I won't do Indianapolis because it's too dangerous, And so I appreciate that. But at the same time, I recognize, hey, Formula One's the pinnacle of motorsport. There's no question about it. But I can enjoy both of them and appreciate what those drivers are doing, because the IndyCar guys may not be Formula One drivers, but they're still pretty damn good.
Yeah, no, listen, I'm not, I don't want it to come across like I'm knocking IndyCar, because it does, as you said, they have great races, and they're all talented guys. But it's the same thing about, it's about the level, and the level is different. Whether you want to admit it or not, the level is different. They're fantastic. Sure. I thought Alex Rossi, who is a great guy, what he did in the 500, he smacks himself up big time. He's limping. He's got a busted finger or whatever it is, and he's up the front at the start, trading places with Lau. And I just thought, wow, Alex, that's fantastic. This is the Alex Rossi that could have made it in Formula One in a different car, maybe.
Yeah.
But the maybes don't count. anymore because he didn't.
Right.
But the fact is that was really impressive. And in the end, it wasn't him who screwed up. It was the team messed him about and he just appeared down the middle of nowhere.
Right.
But that is, there are top guys. I mean, Palau is a top talent for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, I'm just comparing. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And comparing may come across as being critical, but it's not really. It's just facing up to realities and saying perhaps things that people don't want to hear sometimes.
Yeah. And again, I'm completely in agreement with you in that F1's the pinnacle, and these guys are going to be. I mean, it's just everything in Formula One is just a notch higher. Whether it's the teams, the way they engineer, the way the drivers perform, all that kind of stuff, the way they prepare. There's just more resources. There's everything. It's just more, and I get it. I guess there's enough kart racer in me where it's just sort of like, I'm okay with everybody just going for it and having a good race, because every once in a while you could go to the local go-kart track and see an outstanding race between a bunch of guys that nobody's ever heard of, and you can still enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, as the person who's the non-racer, the one who came to motorsport actually through Formula One more than IndyCar as an American, I think, if anything, I see value and esteem both. I know we say that Formula One is the pinnacle, but I also don't know that you're truly comparing apples to apples. And I see a lot of similarities, but I also see a lot of difference in both their history of how they developed, what they focus on, and enough differentials that makes me say that they're in their respective motorsport ecosystems are the pinnacle. And that doesn't distract from one or the other. And if anything, people making the jump between the two show how different they actually are from one another. Because in the case of IndyCar, how to get to that level and to develop within that system is very different than what you have to do to be a European, especially when you're looking at it from an American perspective. And a European perspective, it develops you to get into that level of Formula One. But I say this and thinking we should have a much larger conversation because day jobs are calling. And I feel like this is a discussion that we could do a whole separate convo on. And I want to put that in if that's okay with you guys. I have a feeling our audience would enjoy this. And I guess this is moderator's privilege. I say this because I watched a video done by an IndyCar driver with the Ferrari boys when it was Carlos and Charles, and they were discussing their two disciplines and the level of respect they had for each other and astonishment of what they were enduring in their respective series only made me think, I think we as observers, and I say this more as me, I'm not even saying Joe, you as an insider in the industry, and Dick, you as a racer. I'm saying as fans who are non-racers, we can easily start to do this attacking of the two instead of realizing that they are quite amazing in and of themselves. And that comparison could come across as if you're attacking when both sides actually have a high level of respect. Do you see where I'm coming from? I see nods of heads.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you on that, but it's exactly the same discussion as with drivers.
Yes,
we're talking about
exactly.
Degrees.
Right.
The degree is, sure, what they do is amazing, but you drop Fernando Alonso into Indianapolis first time, he looks like he might win it. That's what I'm saying. It's just the level of difference is very small, and that's significant.
I would even say Fernando is in of himself is a genius that I don't even know. I don't even.
Yeah, right. He's a freak of nature. Let's start there. But
to say that okay, we could totally keep going. So and I want to respect everybody's.
Let's put it down to this. It's those 2 extra tenths of a second.
That's what it is.
That's what it is. I mean, pick a number. It may be half a second, but it's a very small amount of difference but there's no question F1 is the pinnacle.
And there's an entire mentality issue, which
okay. So
too.
we will definitely have to have this conversation, and I look forward to it, gentlemen. Okay, friends, what did you think of our conversation? Drop me a line via email, Sabrina@2guysaGirlandF1.com. Can you help us out? If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow us and give us 5 stars on your favorite podcast app, as well as share this episode with other F1 fans. We know our growth is because of you, and the guys and I thank you. And with that, let me say, we'll keep talking and you can keep listening in, because we're just 2 guys, a girl, and F1. For John, Dick, and me, Sabrina, thanks for listening.